So I want to start this off by giving a former sincere apology to Andy Muschietti's The Flash, which came out last year, which while some people enjoyed, I initially had a very negative reaction to. Yeah, well that looks like the fucking Dark Knight now. Not even joking. So I want to do my best to avoid sounding like an entitled, angry fanboy on the internet, because I really hate that extremist fanboy mentality that we see so often everywhere, where people are literally attacking other people for not having this shared consensus opinion, and I don't really understand the point of that, and that's not at all what this video is trying to do, nor do I personally think I'm owed anything as an audience member or as a fan myself. That being said, the recent Crisis on Infinite Earths Trilogy did honestly leave me kind of pissed off about a lot of things, and more just shocked and I guess fascinated by the fact that we see such scummy, high-level Hollywood business practices being reflected on such a small, low-budget, animated direct-to-DVD film, or films, I guess, because there's 3 of them for some fucking reason. Now, first off, I think it might be somewhat important to explain my background as a DC fan and as a fan of DC animation in particular. I'm a huge fan of Batman the Animated Series. I grew up with Batman the Animated Series. It was like my favorite show as a kid. I also just sort of grew up with the DC animated universe in general, because I went on to watch stuff like Justice League and Justice League Unlimited. I also grew up watching all of those direct-to-DVD DC Universe animated movies, and that was kind of my exposure to a lot of classic DC stories. I know it's kind of hit or miss how well those succeed at being adaptations, but nevertheless, I watched them pretty consistently, always got excited for the next one to be released. However, I started to lose interest once they began to focus more on continuity-driven stuff, and I believe that started with like Justice League War or whatever. I really enjoyed the Flashpoint paradox, which led right into that new universe, but I guess I noticed just a sudden drop in quality, and at that point I was no longer religiously watching every single one of them. I would watch some here and there, but I didn't really care as much about keeping up with it. However, once Justice League Dark Apocalypse War came out and I realized that there was actually a conclusion to this DC animated movie universe, that was enough incentive for me to watch through all of them, because at least I knew it led somewhere to a definitive ending, or at least somewhat definitive. And overall, I'm honestly glad I watched them. I probably won't ever rewatch a lot of those movies, but as a 19-year-old, whenever I did watch through all of them, I remember thinking they were pretty fun and breezy, and while the majority of them were pretty forgettable, it was still nice to see a somewhat competent attempt at a DC cinematic universe, because that's certainly not what we were getting in live action. But more importantly, at the time, I felt it led to a really great finale. Flawed, but mostly solid. I remember really enjoying Justice League Dark Apocalypse War like more than any of the other ones in that universe. But what I became even more excited for was that it seemed like it was going to set up an all-new continuity of DC animated movies. Because while I was able to enjoy the DC animated movie universe for what it was at that time, even back then I knew there was a lot of room for improvement, especially compared to stuff we'd seen before in the DC animated realm. And that leads directly into the Tomorrowverse, which I have never really liked all that much. I had a decent start with Superman Man of Tomorrow, I think that's what it's called, which is a pretty mediocre movie, but at the start, once I was just now being introduced to this new visual style, which is honestly a lot more unique than the visual presentation of the previous continuity, which had a generic anime look. This one looked a bit more comic booky, it had a more striking aesthetic, the characters all had thick outlines, which I love. And while it wasn't the most polished, and I could see that there was still some glaring signs of low budget, there was enough promising about that Superman movie that made me feel like, okay, I'm on board for this new Tomorrowverse. And then we got the Batman Long Halloween movies, and I think before then we had that Justice Society movie, but I didn't watch that one. I love the Batman Long Halloween comic book, and Batman in general just might be my favorite fictional character of all time, so I was pretty excited for it. Part 1 came and went. I thought it was decent, but again, pretty flawed. I started noticing a trend with this new continuity where for some reason there was just a lot of drawn out exposition, and there was a lot of really awkward dry air in between scenes. Like the editing was just super off.
Respectfully, sir, if our security is dependent on $600 worth of iron alloy...
This city is fallen, Alfred.
Then we must endeavor to lift it up again, Bruce.
But still, I liked it. I thought that Batman looked great. I thought that Jensen Ackles did a pretty good job voicing him, and it seemed like a decent adaptation for that part of the story that was covered. But then The Long Halloween Part 2 came out, and I kind of fucking hated it. The majority of the movie was pretty decent, but god, the ending was absolutely abysmal. I only watched it once back when it came out, so my memory might be a little bit rusty on it, but I seem to remember Batman finding the holiday killer and it being Harvey's wife or something like that, and I think that's somewhat consistent with the source material. But then he just lets her go. He literally lets her get away with murder, and like, isn't the point of Batman that he's supposed to apprehend criminals? He just makes her promise to stop killing and lets her go, and I remember being like, wow, that just kind of ruined the entire movie. And then literally the last 10 seconds of the movie is like, it just felt like the editor gave up. I'll just show it right now. Like, this is actually the way The Long Halloween Part 2 ends. Like, what the fuck was that? But what's even worse, somehow, is the after credit scene, which feels like it was made by a 10-year-old.
It's for you, sir.
And I'm assuming that was literally just created in one day, because if there was any more time spent on that, then that's kind of embarrassing. But yeah, after that, I honestly just lost all hope and interest for the remainder of that, and I moved on with my life. I got into other genres of entertainment outside of just the superhero spectrum. I remember my friend and I watched that Green Lantern movie that came out, the Jon Stewart origin story movie, just because we both heard it was terrible and we wanted to react to it. And yeah, it wasn't even so bad. It was funny. It was just dreadfully boring. But then I heard that this Tomorrowverse series was reaching its conclusion, and it was going to have a 3-part finale adapting the Crisis on Infinite Earths comic book run. I only read a little bit of the comic, so I can't really speak so much as to how this works as an adaptation, but from what I can tell, it definitely cuts a lot of stuff and reshapes almost everything about it. And from the few issues that I did read of that run, I immediately knew this was nearly impossible to adapt into a movie. It's just an extremely complicated story that could only really work in comics when you have all those years of build-up and continuity and everything. So I was skeptical, and really I just didn't care. That is until I heard that Part 3 showcased Kevin Conroy's final performance as Batman. So then I was like, fuck, okay, I guess I have to watch this whole trilogy just so I can get the context of whatever this cameo is. And it wasn't just like a random one-off Batman cameo. Apparently, he was playing the animated series version of Batman. And apparently, Mark Hamill was going to reprise his role as Joker, and it was going to be literally the last time we got to see Kevin Conroy Batman and Mark Hamill Joker together in a scene. And I didn't want to just experience that on its own. I wanted the full emotional context of everything. And Part 3 just recently came out, and I started seeing screenshots online. I was like, well, I guess it's time. I gotta binge through all 3 of these fuckers. And looking back, I really wish I didn't, because that is 4.5 hours of my life that I will never get back. Now, I know in the thumbnail I said the worst thing DC has ever done. You might be thinking to yourself, okay, these aren't that great of movies, but this is nowhere near the level of something like maybe Batman and Robin or Batman v Superman or something like that. I don't know. I mean, I somewhat disagree, even just on the technical quality level, because God, they're dreadfully boring. I know that I said the comic series is overly convoluted and it would take a lot to adapt something like that, but the amount of story that they took from that and covered within these 3 movies could have been told in one movie. It's definitely a Hobbit syndrome. And whenever the standalone movies themselves were already padded out and boring and full of exposition, when you're taking one of those and spreading it so thin that it's 3 movies, it's literally nothing. It's the cinematic equivalent of empty calories. And especially Part 2, where I feel like literally nothing happened for an hour and a fucking half. And that's not to say that there aren't glimmers of goodness sprinkled throughout all three of these movies, because there are a few scenes where I genuinely went, wow, that was really good, or was like, wow, this seems like a really interesting character. I'm sure that a better artist could have like really done something powerful with that. But truth be told, these aren't the most incompetent things I've ever seen, but I do feel largely scammed, and that is largely because of the fact that they marketed this on that Kevin Conroy has his last performance in the movie, or in the third movie at least. They literally showed in the trailer B-Taz Batman fighting B-Taz Joker, and maybe I should have put a spoiler warning in this video, but the trailer didn't seem to think any of this was a spoiler whatsoever, so here we are. Yeah, that scene is like just under a minute long. Kevin Conroy has one line of dialogue, and so does Joker, who, by the way, is not Mark Hamill. Like, I'm pretty certain that is not Mark Hamill. He's credited as Mark Hamill. IMDb says it's Mark Hamill. Yeah, it's not Mark Hamill. It honestly sounds a lot like the voice that they had for the other Joker in the movie, and it's not even the greatest imitation of Mark Hamill either. I'm really like not trying to have one of these crazy fanboy conspiracy theories, but like just listen to it. Like that's not Mark, and I feel like if anyone would know, it would be me. That might be pompous to say, but it's true. Not only, like I said, did I grow up watching the animated series and all of that countless times, I've also spent my entire life listening to the nuances of his voice and trying to mimic it myself.
Oh, Batman, we have got to stop meeting like this. When do they get a load of me? I must say, Batsy, I'm flattered. The end of the world, and you want to spend it with me? I didn't know you cared.
I must say, Batsy, I'm flattered. The end of the world, and you want to spend it with me. I didn't know you cared.
So if this is not Mark Hamill, let's say that he wasn't sick or something, or just had an off day when he was recording, which even if that's the case, it still doesn't sound like him at all, even under those circumstances. The only two things I could think of is, thing one, they originally weren't going to have Mark Hamill because it was just going to be cheaper to have the other Joker voice actor. But then when Kevin Conroy died, they decided, okay, we should bring in Mark Hamill. So they re-recorded that scene with Mark Hamill, but for some reason the cut that was released digitally had the previous audio recording in on accident, and maybe we'll get the Mark Hamill version released like on Blu-ray or something. Or, hear me out, maybe it was just cheaper to pay Mark Hamill the money to put his name on the movie, but to not actually have him record the dialogue. I really hope that's not the case, and I don't want to assume that's the case. But frankly, looking at what this is, I wouldn't be super surprised, because you know what this is? You know what this whole trilogy is? It is a cynical corporate product. This is not art. This is not an expression of any kind. This is a scam, and this is a waste of time. Now, I feel like I'm not offering much in the way of constructive or interesting criticism when it comes to these three movies, and that's largely because there's not much at all to talk about. Like, they're just so dry. There's nothing to really dissect. There's nothing to really sink your teeth into. They're just fucking boring and thin. And I find it extremely scummy that they really went the Sony approach by showing the spoiler 1-minute cameos in the trailer. Like, yeah, that Super Friends scene that you saw in the trailer, you only get like 1 or 2 more seconds of it in the movie. Yeah, there are like 2 cameos, I think, that aren't spoiled, but at that point, it's just like, who cares? I really feel like they banked off of the fact that they had Kevin Conroy's final performance as a means of selling this movie, because why else would anyone care? And that's really gross to me. To get slightly personal, I mentioned growing up with Batman the Animated Series and stuff like that. Well, I had somewhat of an inconsistent upbringing. My parents were separated, so I kind of had to go back and forth between both their houses growing up, and it was pretty hard at times. But the one thing that kept me grounded, the one thing that I did have consistently, was Batman. Batman was my earliest hyperfixation. It has been my special interest my entire life, and specifically Kevin Conroy's take on Batman was what I so deeply connected with. And the day Kevin Conroy died, and I know this sounds a little dramatic, but this is just honestly how I handled it, I cried quite a bit, and I was pretty devastated. He was always on my celebrity bucket list of people I needed to meet, but I never got to. Thankfully, plenty of other fans who he also meant something to did get to meet him, and he just genuinely seems like he was such a good, warm soul. And I think that I also have a kind of deep connection to Kevin Conroy because of the fact he's the only queer Batman. And whenever I found out that my favorite Batman I connected with was also a queer person, that was a really important moment for me. And to see that they took all of that just to shamelessly try and sell this boring nothingness piece of shit, I found to be insulting. And I know this is just a movie, these are just movies. To say that any of it is genuinely insulting is a little silly, but yeah, I thought that this was kind of gross and just very much so reflective of the grossest parts of cynical corporate Hollywood. And you know, I mentioned at the beginning I want to apologize to the Flash movie from last year, because even though that had like this cynical sense of nostalgia bait, at least the movie marketed what it was. Michael Keaton Batman was in the trailer and he ended up being a full support character. He wasn't just in one moment at the end of the movie. And while that movie also had those really shitty 1-minute cameos at the end, at least they didn't put them in the trailer, though that was also arguably offensive too, for the same reasons that I just complained about Kevin Conroy, considering that they used George Reeves and Christopher Reeves and stuff like that. But that's a topic for another time. So maybe I'm being a little bit harsh when I say this is the worst thing DC has ever done, but it just felt like a personal attack. But also it just genuinely felt like a waste of time. And as I've gotten older, I've really tried to branch out and explore as many avenues of art and cinema as I can. And I've really found a lot of interesting art that I've really deeply connected with on a spiritual level. And as I was sitting there watching this, and I remembered being a kid, and you know, this is what my life centered around, was watching this DC animated stuff, and then how I felt now, I was almost questioning the fact that if I didn't grow up with these characters or anything, how much even those would have mattered. And now I'm sort of just recontextualizing everything, and I'm wondering if maybe it's not even the movie's fault fully. I'm wondering if I'm just growing out of this, which is normal and that's natural, and it's something that I don't want to reject. I think these movies have their audience. It doesn't seem like a lot of people totally disagree with what I'm saying here. I think people generally liked it a little bit more than me, but the responses to these movies is pretty mediocre. But watching these movies almost seems like this point in my adolescence, growing into adulthood, where I think maybe it's time to move on from this superhero shit. I'm pretty certain I will always at least have a strong connection to Batman, but I'm done with these DC animated movies. I'm done with all of it. That being said, My Adventures with Superman kicks so much ass. I love that show.